Good afternoon, everyone. Though I must confess that it is about 1:30 in the morning of the 2nd June here in New Delhi. Let me begin by thanking the organizers for having invited me to speak at this Congress. And though one may complain about online conferences, they have at least managed to keep academic communication going in dark and trying times. My talk today is divided into two parts. The first raises several historiographic issues confronting global and transcultural history, particularly in relation to mathematics in particular. And the second part discusses some of my published and unpublished work on the history of this circulation in 19th century India against against the backdrop of concerns raised in the first part. Uh, Now, the historiography of mathematics of the non-Western world uh, had long appeared immune to the influence of cultural studies or the critiques of Orientalism. The turn to ethnomathematics and the interrogation of the historiography of proof as boundary marker, the internal challenges to foundationalism, have all played a role in pluralizing conceptions of mathematics. Furthermore, the practice of mathematics, unlike many sciences, continues to manifest a dynamic and positive relationship with its past. How else is one to understand why mathematicians pursue problems that are 300 years old, or why the theoretical astrophysicist and Nobel laureate S. Chandrasekhar produced a book on Newton's Principia at the end of the 20th century? Recent studies on the historiography of non-Western mathematical traditions in Western histories of mathematics produced at the end of the 18th and the beginning of the 19th century in Europe reveal the shaping of the historiographical landscape by the changing representations of the Orient in a European historical discourse. Splintered, of course, across varying national interpretative traditions. Thus, as I have argued elsewhere, the Scottish reading of the Indian mathematical tradition was at variance with the French one, for example. How do we write a history about the similarities and differences among mathematical traditions that is cognitively just? The relationship between the history of mathematics and Orientalism has been a subject of interest for some time now that sometime now and offers a nuanced understanding of the complicated relationship between the Orientalist imaginary and the historiography of the mathematics of the Islamicate of South Asia and the Far East. These studies have critiqued the meta-narratives that framed histories of mathematics and identified the deficit theories underpinning these accounts. These deficit theories turned out to be meta-narratives for coping with difference rather than providing an explanation for an absence or lack thereof. These deficits were parceled out into binary dichotomies flowing out of a discourse of modernity and colonialism or that of the civilizing mission. The binary dichotomies provided a scaffolding and aided in drawing boundaries between disciplines, demarcating temporal contours around the knowledge thus constituted. This Orientalist episteme of science was deconstructed by postcolonial theory and history of science. A recently published work on the historiography of non-Western science debated the possibility of developing some historiographical guidelines as a Lacatosian negative heuristic, a how not to. This cautionary project sought to ensure that the critique of Eurocentric history of science or mathematics would not lapse into producing other centrisms, institutional or philosophical. What methodological guidelines and reflexivity would alert the historian of science or mathematics all right, to possible historical lapses. Several of these concerns have been articulated in the writings of global, transcultural, and transnational history. The problem could be framed within the conventional philosophy of science with the intention of going around that of radical incommensurability. One way of reading Kuhn's The Structure of Scientific Revolutions is an account of the evolution of scientific knowledge that allows for the waywardness and contingencies of history, even though the account is framed within a stadial theory of scientific evolution. But this stadial development is not to be seen in terms of a purificatory process wherein more adequate theories supersede less adequate ones. The question we ask ourselves is how Kuhn's theory works within the social sciences and humanities. On pushing the Kuhnian theory of science to its logical social constructivist conclusion, the question arises of the radical incommensurability of scientific paradigms and the possibility of transparadigmatic adjudication. But the same constructivist argument could be employed to show that incommensurable theories are rendered commensurable through the application of agreed standards in spite of the possibility that the socio-psychological paradigmatic scaffoldings may not be commensurable, even though, right? What happens when we extend the argument from the empirical scientific disciplines to the domain of mathematics? Acknowledging that mathematical concepts are man-made does not necessarily imply that mathematical propositions have no objective reality. The other aspect of this historiographical essay concerns the Orientalist representation of knowledge, in this specific instance, mathematical knowledge. This knowledge was framed by the binary dichotomies of the history of mathematics, such as the geometric, proof-driven, theoretical, axiomatic deductive Western mathematical tradition, and the algebraic, demonstration-oriented, procedural, and intuitive Eastern mathematical traditions. These dichotomies may be seen as ways of comprehending distinct mathematical practices, but equally as schemas for framing distinct mathematical styles. The goal of a constructivist history of mathematics would be to unveil the social processes and practices that contextualize the trope of the geometric West and the algebraic East. But the algebra geometry distinction itself is an overstretched and overemphasized one in the literature, as is recognized by contemporary works in mathematics proper. Furthermore, recent research reveals that civilizations cannot be uniquely characterized in terms of the dichotomies mentioned. In fact, they would at best have a heuristic value for coping with distinct ways of pursuing mathematics. Civilizational knowledge can be internally heterogeneous, and what is considered as a civilizational signature may be no more than one dominant style during a given historical juncture or period. Furthermore, as the historian Ramla Thapar has pointed out in her lecture on constructing heritage, the four components that comprise the entity of civilization, namely territoriality, language, religion, and the sensibility of a classical age, are all up for interrogation. This brings us to a larger point. Before the arrival of national histories and historiographies, historians of mathematics adopted civilizations as units for framing the early histories of mathematics. And well after nationalist historiographies began to frame the history of mathematics, civilizational accounts provided the backdrop to nationalist accounts in the sense that nations grew out of civilizations. Clearly, since mathematical diversity was difficult to capture within a civilizational framework, Sal Restivo, in his book Mathematics and Society in History, Sociological Inquiries, proposed an episodic history of mathematics when speaking of India, while for China his account is framed by the rubric of the mathematics of survival. Inspired in part by Spengler's chapter on number in The Decline of the West, Restivo engages with the diversity of mathematical traditions. But the analysis still operates within the civilizational framework. The diversity he engages with then is diversity across time, but not across civilization at a given time. However, this account of the Indian mathematical traditions is based on a very limited characterization of its primary accomplishments, such as the decimal place value system, infinite power series, indeterminate equations. From this, it is inferred that the history of mathematics in India is episodic rather than defined by a theme or style. Since the mathematical problems and themes this basket of mathematical resources did or could have enabled required further elaboration. Thus, an opportunity to epistemically characterize ostensibly disconnected episodes is lost. These connections were subsequently elaborated in the writings of M.D. Srinivas and Kim Plofka. In the 1980s, Sandra Harding spoke of a historiographical revolution. In the 1990s, she spoke of the historiographical revolution of the 1980s at the intersection of post-colonial philosophy of science, feminist philosophy of science, and post-colonial history of science. This revolution just about preceded the rise of global world and transcultural history in the 1990s and entailed a shift from the primary focus on nations to one on transnational actors and multi-state organizations. This shift is also reflected in the rise of the terms global and transnational in the literature as a prefix to qualify the historiography underpinning research titles. In other words, the move to the transnational was an attempt to denationalize and deterritorialize history by exploring historical themes and conceptions and as they moved across fuzzy boundaries and national borders. Those doing global history were doing the same to nation-centric history by studying phenomena of global dimensions such as the migration of human populations and diseases, the growth and expansion of communication technologies, and the globalization of the scientific research system. Global histories were thus preoccupied with global connections and interactions, and distinct waves of globalization corresponded to the establishment of new connections. This might entail the intensification of contacts within a region or the inclusion of isolated regions. Akira Irie pointed out that while the terms global history and transnational history are frequently used interchangeably, they both require exploring interconnectedness through the transgression of national boundaries. Secondly, they are both concerned with themes of global dimensions and not just one region or nation. These premises then challenge both Eurocentrism in history as well as globalization of chronologies and themes relevant in a European and North American history. This confrontation is essential in the interest of cognitive justice, or else transnational or global history will merely re-signify the Eurocentric account in a different way rather than simulate the emergence of a multicentric picture. Global history's engagement with exchange processes across borders and cultures was reflected in a movement whose principal tenets entailed orchestrating a multicentric polyphony and the decentering of a European and Western power in world history. This would have been possible only if global and transnational history invents terms, categories, and concepts that are not exclusively parasitic upon the European historical experience. A conceptual vocabulary derived from other historical contexts as well as other subjects and subjectivities would be required. The end of the Cold War and accelerated communication and migration provided a fillip to global history. Earlier influences from the 1950s and the 60s, such as the encyclopedic work of Joseph Needham, followed several decades later by the studies of Gunther Frank, Pomeranz, John Hobson, played a significant role in narrating a connected history highlighting the processes of reciprocal interaction between regions. This in turn underplayed the importance and feasibility of producing purely national histories. This first wave was followed by a second wave of transnational studies, this time located within a larger semantic field of trans studies that included the translocal, transcultural, and related transurbanism, etc. These fields were anchored within cultural studies and anthropology. These trends diffused into the history of science, and the British Journal of the History of Science, as well as ISIS and Osiris, similarly published special issues on global history or transcultural history, discussing themes that traveled across and beyond borders, mapping the interplay between research on the history of science and transcultural studies. The deeper challenge raised by the study of transnational science concerns the inner tension between epistemic universalism, which characterizes scientific knowledge as uncontaminated by social geography, culture, and ethnic differences, and the conception of science as socially grounded and arising from the flow of knowledge across national borders. Within these frameworks, this challenge was addressed with the emergence of the hybrid forms of knowledge that gave rise to the diversely constituted entity called modern science. There is also a recognition of the changing landscape and the emergence of a new topos shared by both science studies and transnational history, both of which have informed the history of science writing. These concerns include, for example, the relationship between expansionist colonial policies and the circulation of knowledge, technologies, and institutions. Engagement with these issues has resulted in the invention of shared categories, notions, and concepts, the most common among them being entanglement, hybridity, co-construction. But the key concept here, which curtails serious engagement with knowledge forms and institutions of non-European cultures, is the concept of science itself. Just as the notion of the sciences has lost some of its shine, so has the notion of nation as reflected in studies on diplomacy and international relations. While these developments have indeed been refreshing and have opened up the field to explore many more geographical and intellectual spaces, one needs to stop and ask whether this nevertheless remains an incestuous development restricted to the Northern Academy, in which the South does not participate. Does any of the work produced within the Chinese Academy or in African, Arab, Turkish, or South Asian institutions have anything to do with the transnational developments discussed? It appears that such cognitive movements will continue to perpetuate a version of Eurocentrism unless they integrate the scholarship produced in the Global South into their reflections. Another theme within the historiography of science is that of the historiography of the scientific revolution, which in turn is underpinned by a theory of modernity and modernization. In what sense can we speak of mathematical revolutions, progress, and the idea of the modernity of mathematics? Joan Richards had argued that the history of mathematics was not amenable to a Kuhnian notion of revolutionary change, and that the history of mathematics does not display the dramatic and discontinuous change that marked the sciences. Richard writes, open quotes, because old mathematics never dies, mathematical history is not Whiggish in the strict sense of the term, unquote. The Kuhnian notion of history complicates the notion of progress but still maintains the distinction between past and present. For what characterizes the history of mathematics is timelessness, not progress, says Richards. However, historians of mathematics such as Judith Grabiner, etc., have suggested that revolutions do occur in mathematics and that revolutionary theories do alter conceptions of truth prevalent among mathematicians. These are issues on which the jury is still out. The circulation of knowledge and knowledge on the move have become important subjects of research in the history of knowledges over the last 2 decades. However, the history of sciences and the history of mathematics in particular have both engaged with the subject for long. The historian of mathematics, Otto Neugebauer, had even put down a set of criteria to establish when historians could conclusively infer whether a transmission of knowledge or a mathematical procedure or idea from one region to another had occurred. The difference in what historians of mathematics did resides then in how this transmission is framed and how the presuppositions of the older generation of studies were problematized in our century. Furthermore, historians of mathematics are well aware that the circulation of mathematical knowledge has never been impeded by barriers of language, geography, or custom. And while this may be more true of goods, techniques, and ideas, it appears to be less so in the case of mathematical ideas, since they are less amenable sometimes to documentation in the remote past, that is, pre-antiquity and perhaps even antiquity. Therefore, writing more specifically about India, David Pingree had pointed out that the history of mathematical astronomy in India was a history of transmissions, concurrent transformation, and indigenous development. And that in this process, India, like many other centers of civilization, over several millennia, as both recipient and transmitter. All right. Yeah. So he identifies 4 phases of transmission to India in a long durée perspective of history. The first wave of transmission was from Mesopotamia in the 5th century before the Common Era. The second of Greek astronomy between the 2nd and 4th century of the Common Era. The third of Islamic astronomy between the 11th and 18th century of the Common Era. And finally, a European astronomy from the 18th century onwards. This long-distance view needs to accommodate the interfoliation between phases and how one phase slides into another or plays a role in its propagation. Normally, this transmission at any one historical juncture is seen in diffusionist rather than interactionist terms. Clearly, within today's context, the traveling knowledge frame expects that diffusionism or simple osmosis make way for one of mutual shaping. Thus, both diffusionism and transmission operate either within the framework of empires or within that of the provenance of truth diffusing osmotically. This is very unlike the notion of the exchange of ideas traveling both ways. Pingree had flagged 3 processes influencing the reception of ideas: the intellectual traditions of the recipient culture transformed the astronomy transmitted in Sanskrit. All right. The transmission influenced the manner in which the science was transmitted, and finally, the idiosyncrasies of the individuals involved in the transmission process. In other words, he too was aware of the limitations of diffusionism. The important point that Pingree makes in passing is that the translation in the 18th century, for example, of Philippe de Lahille's Tabulae Astronomicae in Jaipur provides us an instance of what might have happened at several other locations across India and other parts of the world. In other words, there is a pattern in this encounter, and the process of reception across cultures and perhaps across times reveals the ontogeny of an encounter. Now, a historian and a historian of mathematics would respond quite differently to similar questions. The historian writing on mathematics is concerned about the institutions and details of the historical context where the production or transmission of this knowledge is conditioned by a complex chain of causes in an almost unlimited past. The mathematically critical historian is drawn towards the present, the past of mathematics as it led to the present. More broadly speaking, history and its related subdisciplines do enrich our understanding of the human mind's evolution over time. But the history of mathematics contributes to the teaching of mathematics itself in several ways. For one, it alerts the pedagogue to the inherent difficulty with certain mathematical concepts, be they infinitesimals, irrationals, imaginary numbers, etc. These concepts develop over hundreds of years, and historical difficulties resemble what Grabener says student difficulties. Further, an account of the emergence of a mathematical concept may motivate students to ask, why did somebody think of it in this way? And finally, the historical context illuminates both for students and practicing mathematicians alike the relationship with the larger landscape of human thought itself. For the identity of modern mathematics, the 19th century has been a particularly important one, for it is the period when the endeavor developed internationally and acquired a shared language of communication across nations, not to mention a disciplinary autonomy. While there still existed national mathematical styles such as the French and the German or Italian, Parshall contends that competed with each other. Parshall argues that by the middle of the 20th century, mathematicians spoke a nationally transcendent mathematical language. So we could argue that the 19th century was one where this disciplinary autonomy became a kind of marker of an identity formation process. At the same time, there were new sites of interaction and consolidation emergent in Asia. The process of slow and gradual transformation, gradual internationalization of the community of mathematicians is one of enhanced connectivity, which mathematical education and mathematical textbooks played a central role in consolidating. But the process is also reflected in the history of mathematics and the manner in which problems were framed, in other words, in the historiography of mathematics. Thus, during the latter half of the 19th century, amidst the British analytics who were simultaneously mathematicians and well grounded in the history of mathematics, were coming around to the view entertained by Sylvester and his network that mathematics is a body of knowledge that develops effectively through the communication of ideas across national boundaries. Support for the same was affirmed by developments in mechanics, potential theory, differential equations, etc. The work of mathematicians from other countries inspired new developments in mathematics. Locating the work of mathematicians within the project of global intellectual history requires that in some way it be linked to social history and the idea of geography be employed more flexibly. While transmission does connote a relation of connectivity, the important point that Sanjay Subramanian brings to connection then is that when discussing circulation between West and East, a deficit theory often enough shadows the narrative of transmission. Within the context of reception, the recipient's version is never as good enough as the original. So while discussing connection, Subramaniam too wishes to go beyond diffusionism, wherein establishing a connection entails detailing the network and their activities and ideas that hold them together. But surely there will be those who seek to go beyond and examine the process of the mutual shaping and retransmission of ideas. But an important methodological suggestion is that of striking a balance between the familiar and less familiar elements, namely between the icons of the canon and the others located outside this immediate context. We do know that the humanities have been shaped for years by 19th century notions of nations and cultures, which created imagined national or cultural communities among both the public and scholars. Again, Sanjay Subramaniam alerts us to how nationalism has blinded us to the possibility of connection. Several disciplines and interdisciplinary fields in the social sciences have been facing the limitations of the cultural boundaries which have fenced off their objects of investigation. Like intellectual history, the history of mathematics needs to eschew its preoccupation with civilizational and national boundaries and to develop a global comparative perspective. Post-colonial history of science and more recently, attempts to decolonize the humanities can be summarized in three intersectional demands. The first of these seeks major revision of the Eurocentric narrative of the history of the sciences, social sciences, and humanities. The second is that studies of the in studies of the global South, Orientalism needs to be substituted in favor of perspectives that acknowledge the complexity of the societies of the global South and diversify and their diversity while provincializing a Europe. The third requires a critical and reflexive engagement with the object of study, the process of the construction of the archive, and most importantly, a cognitive attentiveness to the narratives so constructed in order that they do not reproduce those that they seek to transcend or disengage from. An entire spectrum of concepts, terms, and vocabulary is being invented or reinvented to advance the writing of global history, and one such proposal suggests three concepts, namely complexity, connection, and comparison. The last two of these we have already encountered, while comparison and connection address the context of the problem being complexity of the problem. Complexity highlights the internal context of a study and a study of its connections that illuminates the external context. More than a decade ago, Galison had a paper where he identified 10 questions for the history and philosophy of science. And it pointed out that what we consider the external and external will continue to challenge us for time to come. The mathematics textbooks produced in 19th century India through the efforts of the officials of the East India Company and missionaries were the instruments for the transformation of a system of education. Any mathematics textbook presents structured, rationalized, and standardized protocols of problem solving, which then serve to create mental schemas or paradigms depending on where one looks at the process or whether one looks at the process from a social cognition theory or philosophy of science. Mathematical texts that were produced during this period function not just as instruments for transforming a world of knowledge, but performed the equally important task of naturalizing the new knowledge within existing iterative practices. Against this background, in several publications, I have tried to situate the encounter between modern mathematics and Indian mathematical practices in 19th century India. This account is pitched against then the backdrop of transcultural networks of mathematicians, historians of mathematics, Indologists, and school teachers. The encounter between the two traditions, the Indian and the modern, in the 19th century was mediated by colonial officials, some of whom were also Indologists, missionaries, and local mathematics teachers from different parts of India. Through the efforts of the British Indologists, there arose the recognition that there were different mathematical traditions in India, and that in the Sanskrit tradition, works like the Bijaganita and the Leelavati, authored by the 12th century mathematician Bhaskara, constituted the canon. While in the Arabic tradition, the Khulasat ul Hisab was seen as the most authoritative text on the Indian subcontinent. These texts were then employed by British educationists as mediatory texts that facilitated the translation from local knowledge schemas and that later colonial officials wished to install in schools and colleges in India. The first and more likely second generation networks of British mathematicians calling themselves the Analytics, that included Augustus de Morgan, George Boole, Sylvester, all played a role in promoting a symbolical approach to algebra and making important changes to instruction in algebra. Contrary to current understanding, it is suggested that the perspective of the second generation analytics on algebra shaped the mathematics curriculum both in England and in colonial India. The so-called reform of British mathematics education was thus intertwined with the transformation of mathematics education in India. The place of algebra in a British liberal education was a matter of central concern in England from the 1830s onwards. Augustus de Morgan, as part of this effort, authored a couple of works such as Elements of Algebra, Preliminary to the Differential Calculus, and Fit for Higher Classes of Schools, The Elements of Arithmetic, 1840, Trigonometry and Double Algebra, 1849. Two of De Morgan's books, The Elements of Arithmetic and The Elements of Algebra, were translated into the Marathi language in 1848 and 1850, respectively, by George Ritso Jervis and with the assistance of several Maharashtrian scholars. The loci for this renewed activity in India were at traditional centers of Sanskrit learning, such as Pune, Banaras, in addition, and Kolkata, in addition to Delhi, which had a significant presence of Persian scholarship, and Calcutta, where there was a concentration of both Persian and Sanskrit scholarship. As the exposure to English education increased in Pune, Marathi scholars such as Bal Shastri Jambekar and others became vectors and teachers of the new knowledge. Clearly, soon enough, textbooks in the Indian vernaculars detailing a European mathematics began to appear. Over time, serious inconsistencies began to show up in translation, and British officials were concerned that these inconsistencies might prove counterproductive and undermine respect for a European knowledge. The vernacular translation societies and the native school book societies established throughout the subcontinent were to identify textbooks used in English schools and colleges on mathematics, physics, and other subjects and submit them to the process of translation and adaptation. Lancelot Wilkinson, an official of the Bombay Civil Service, was very closely involved in school mathematics and astronomy education. A forthcoming paper of mine discusses his relationship with another network of British mathematicians, Pandits from Banaras and Indologists from Germany. I take this opportunity to revisit some work my colleague Irfan Habib and I did in the 1990s on a mathematics teacher in Delhi, Master Ramachandra, who published a work on introductory calculus in Urdu called the Sari-ul Fahm, starting with a knowledge of methods involving solution of equations as taught in the traditional curriculum, inspired, of course, by the Bijaganita of Bhaskara. The work was discovered by Dr. Sprenger, head of the Department of Public Instruction in Delhi, who requested Ramachandra to translate it into English. The first translation appeared as a treatise on the problems of maxima and minima in 1851. Sprenger sent the book to De Morgan, who then pushed for the publication of the book in London, where it was published in 1859, with the hope that it would be introduced in English schools. It was precisely because some of the protocols of differentiation and integration had not been resolved that Ramachandra felt that certain ideas relating to the determination of the maxima and minima of a polynomial expression could be introduced and solved without recourse to the notions of limits and the differential coefficient. In other words, the calculus syllabus for schools had not yet been finalized, and the hope was to delay the introduction of concepts central to calculus until some degree of finalization had been achieved. And this was precisely why De Morgan pressed for the book's publication in England. De Morgan labeled the impetus behind the work the Ramachandra problem for mathematicians, but in fact it could be considered the shared dilemma of mathematics education both in England and India and possibly elsewhere in the middle of the 19th century. That the problem has nevertheless not gone away is reflected in a publication as late as the 1990s by a Canadian computer scientist in the Mathematical Intelligencer, provocatively entitled De Morgan's Ramanujan. In 1863, in hiding in a post-mutiny Delhi, Ramachandra went on to publish a second book called A Specimen of a New Method of Differential Calculus, called the Method of Constant Ratios. Reading through the preface, one immediately gets the feeling that closure had still not been achieved by the 1860s and that methods, protocols, and procedures were still being debated amongst mathematicians, teachers. Right? In the work, Ramachandra begins by pointing out that there were at least four older methods relating to differential calculus: the method of fluxions, infinitesimal calculus, calculus of functions, and that of limits. Finding that there were objections to all of them, but the four methods were related to each other, and it was Lagrange, as the inventor of the calculus of functions, who had offered a definition of the differential based on the other methods. Ramachandra's own approach was a synthetic one that sought to continue the advantages and to avoid the defects of the four old methods. What is noteworthy here is the string of mathematicians he draws into his review: Cournot, De Morgan, Navier, Schleumig, etc. Furthermore, he had read at least the most important works published in the 1850s and engaged with the same problem. In other words, the jury was still out on the methods of differential calculus, even as the subject was being introduced in England and India. In addition, Ramachandra saw his book as suggesting what might be achieved by the methods he sought to develop, and that he wished that his labor might be found of some real benefit in the Department of Mathematical Education. This book, however, did not meet the same reception in England as the previous one. One possible reason is that the mathematicians associated with the Analytic Club were not promoting Newton's methods of fluxion and fluence, but continued calculus and its methods extending from Leibniz to Lagrange. The tendency amongst historians of mathematics studying the transmission of, say, calculus in the 19th century has been to assume that as a subject it acquired a cogent identity in terms of procedures, algorithms, and an identity derivable from the Newton-Leibniz corpus, rather than engaging with the elaboration of the procedures of calculus embedded in several genealogies in the century that followed. In these disciplinary histories, historians of science tend to overemphasize what scientists and mathematicians do rather than what science and mathematics teachers do. A point recently reiterated by John Agar in his introductory remarks to his book. Histories of mathematics may exhibit a tendency to focus too much upon certain canonical texts rather than their context. Or to use a term from Agar, the working worlds of teaching and transmission. Attention to these contexts, working worlds, distributes the problematic of the origins of calculus across a wide variety of cultures, regions, and actors. The British Indologist Colebrooke had played a role in the early part of the 19th century in canonizing certain Sanskrit works as a representative of the mathematical and logical traditions of India for 19th century Indologists. Colebrooke's translation of Brahmagupta's and Bhaskara's work played a role in stimulating a European interest in Indian algebra. The discovery of the so-called Hindu syllogism through his engagement with Gautama's Nyaya Sutra became the standard reference on Indian logic through the 19th century, generating in the process great interest and influence amongst mathematicians at the Royal Society and the interest of researchers and Indologists at the Royal Asiatic Society. British educationists predisposed to a certain kind of utilitarianism subsequently canonized the Nyaya Sutra as a bridge to the Novum Organum. The idea of engraftment premised on the notion that the study of Sanskrit was worthy in its own right, and that the mathematics and arithmetic of algebra of the Hindus was grounded on the same principles as those of Europe, played an important role in initiating the reconciliation between different mathematical traditions. Engraftment was in effect simultaneously an educational methodology and a conciliatory policy that required that the study of a European science and literature be engrafted upon the established methods of scientific and literary instruction in Sanskrit and Persian. More specifically, in Benares, traditional Sanskrit scholars and mathematicians such as the legendary Bapudeva Shastri and his contemporary Vitthal Rao and Sudhakar Dwivedi collaborated with Ballantyne and others in the translation first of Bacon's Novum Organum into Sanskrit. Right. And not only did they translate the work, they responded to the work and critiqued it. But the translations of these mathematician philosophers gave credence to the idea of the Nyaya constituting the methodological organon of the Indian sciences. Similarly, Colebrooke's The Algebra with Arithmetic and Mensuration was prepared in consultation with Sanskrit Pandits in India. The book was probably completed on his return to Britain, and 250 copies published by the leading London publisher John Murray. The book received a detailed review from John Playfair himself, the Scottish mathematician, and while congratulating Colebrooke on his effort, was a very balanced review in the light of what was known at the time. The detailed review brought the book to the notice of the mathematicians George Peacock, De Morgan, and George Boole. The network of British analytics were thus alerted to the works of the British Indologists. The influence of Playfair on the work of Indologists such as Samuel Davis, Reuben Burrow, Edward Strachey, and others has been discussed in earlier papers. But the links were more than merely conceptual or based on the interest in the history of mathematics. In fact, they possibly evolved over time. On a more personal level, Colebrook's son, George, wished to pursue an honours degree at Trinity College, Cambridge. On Colebrook's request, Charles Babbage had him inscribed for enrollment. So his son went on to Cambridge in 1828 under the tutorship of George Peacock, who we know from elsewhere was clearly acquainted with Colebrook and his work. Furthermore, what is striking here is not that Colebrook suddenly revealed to the community of European mathematicians the significance of the Bij Ganita, but how it came to occupy such a significant position among the several translations available. The reception of Colebrook's translations was linked to the mathematical network within which these translations were received. It appears that Colebrook's translations traveled most easily amongst mathematicians and was discussed not just in the circles of the analytics, but equally among the German mathematicians Cantor, Henkel, and Zeuthen. But another point which one could bring up here is that the British analytics were not just interested in the history of mathematics, but their interest was linked with contemporary mathematical concerns. These concerns were equally those of mathematics education that threw up problems of research for mathematicians. As argued elsewhere, Peacock's interest in Brahmagupta's work is clearly of this nature. For Peacock, Colebrook's translation of the 12th chapter of the Brahmasputa Siddhanta has a very contemporary ring to it. This engagement with the deep past of mathematics for a very present project has a significance for Peacock as much as for De Morgan. De Morgan turns to the work of Bhaskara, also discussed in the Colebrook volume. It was earlier argued that De Morgan's interest in the work of the Indian polymath Ramachandra's treaty was due to his active engagement with mathematics education and his deep interest in India explained by the circumstances of his birth in India and the history of Indian mathematics provided him a resource and a frame for the expansion of the role of algebra in a mathematics curriculum. However, Joan Richard's extensive writing on De Morgan clearly establishes a dynamic relationship between De Morgan's mathematical researches, his concrete engagement with the history of mathematics, including Indian mathematics, and mathematics education. De Morgan was acutely conscious of the relationship between these distinct domains, and perhaps in his own time the distinctions between them were not so well defined. The larger concern was to convince his colleagues that the exploration of the curious byways of mathematical history provide both insights into mathematical research as well as crucial clues to understanding mathematics. In approaching the development of algebra, more specifically on the status of negative and impossible numbers, it is De Morgan's entry on the negative and impossible quantities in the Penny Encyclopedia that De Morgan points out such quantities were addressed in Bhaskaracharya's Bija Ganita. Just as John Ballantyne at Banaras College turned to Nyaya for engrafting Baconian science into a newly organized curriculum, Dr. Sprenger in Delhi in the 1840s and later George Rizzo Jervis in Bombay Presidency turned to De Morgan's work in order to construct a bridge from the Bija Ganita to modern algebra, while Ramachandra attempted to construct the bridge from the Bija Ganita to elementary calculus. This to and fro, this construction was possible due to the groundwork of the British Indologists and the inculcation of a widespread understanding that Indian mathematics was largely algebraic. So Ritso Jervis, likewise in Bombay, was responsible for the translation, the publication, and introduction of the new sciences and mathematics texts that had been translated into Marathi, that were translated into Marathi. He shared the Orientalist understanding that education should be imparted in the local languages and not English, merely in English. In Bombay Presidency, the most widely spoken languages were Marathi and Gujarati. As part of this effort, he commissioned the translation of Hutton's Mathematics and two books of De Morgan, The Elements of Algebra and The Elements of Arithmetic. He himself took up the task of translation of Hutton's Elements of Geometry from Hutton's course of Mathematics and The Elements of Algebra of Hutton and Bonnycastle. The translated version of The Elements of Arithmetic was published, De Morgan's Elements of Arithmetic was published as Anka Ganitacha Moola Pitika, while The Elements of Algebra was translated as Bija Ganita Moola Pitika. Both these works were translated into Marathi by the same set of mathematical teachers with Jervis, that is, Vishnu Sundar Chhatre, Gangadhar Shastri Phadke, and Govind Gangadhar Phadke. When discussing the circulation of modern mathematical knowledge, it is important to recognize that from the 1780s to the 1930s, there were strong intellectual and social ties linking Scottish and English mathematicians with British Indologists, who in turn had ties with Sanskrit and Persian-speaking scholars and mathematics teachers in India. In the 1780s, John Playfair had played a major role in shaping Indology's mathematical concerns as well as a second-order interpretation of the Indian mathematical tradition. The translation into English of this so constituted Sanskrit mathematical canon circulated amongst English mathematicians in the early decades of the 19th century, informing not just the history of mathematics as it was to subsequently evolve, but contemporaneous concerns of mathematics and mathematics education. In the cities of Pune, Mumbai, Delhi, Banaras, and Kolkata, mathematics teachers at the turn of the 19th century began to debate what a new mathematics curriculum might look like, how mathematics was to be taught in the new schools, and how mathematics teachers from existing schools could be drawn into teaching the new mathematics. And given the variety of interpretations of the Anglo-Orientalist controversy, it could be argued that a second-order interpretation of the Indian mathematical tradition acquired currency and provided openings for the introduction of the new mathematics. However, within a more global perspective on the circulation of mathematical knowledge, or more specifically calculus in the mid-19th century, and mathematics education per se, the identity of calculus and its procedures and protocols were certainly not settled or finalized. In fact, there were still debates and controversies relating to what should be taught and how, in England as well. And one important interlocutor both in England and India was Augustus De Morgan, who was involved with the Clarendon Commission, charged with looking into mathematics education in England. Historians of science such as Roy MacLeod and historians like Chris Bailey and anthropologically oriented historians such as Peter van der Veer have all independently argued that the processes of modernization in England were deeply entangled with those underway in India at the time, something that historians of science working on South Asia have been familiar with for at least little over a decade. What I have tried to argue here is that despite differences, 17th century mathematicians in India and might have understood the mathematical problems they were respectively pursuing. However, their approaches may have been, though their approaches may have been determined in very different mathematical worlds characterized by their corresponding forms of calculation. In the 19th century, so called modern calculus was not introduced de novo into the mathematical curriculum in South Asia, but was framed by the idea of engraftment. In other words, it demanded attention to the mathematical practices of the region, which could then be employed as a base for the introduction of calculus. The process of modernizing the mathematical curriculum in India was concurrent with similar processes in Great Britain, signaling that the place and protocols of calculus for a mathematics education had not yet stabilized. Common themes were the subject of debate in both countries. The history of the circulation of scientific knowledge in 19th century India draws attention to the relationship between a variety of learned associations and societies established under imperial rule, the changing character of traditional or local institutions of higher learning, as well as the agenda of colonial education. The primary vehicle for the transmission of formal scientific knowledge was the school and college textbook. Produced for a culturally alien readership, the translator had to confront not just the problem of knowability, but the problem of translatability. The standard historiography of transmission through translation has proved inadequate. The ontogeny of scientific translations recognizes the deep connection between translation activity and research on what preceded the translation or was contemporaneous with it. The aim of translation was not merely to contribute to the evolution of the sciences, but as an enabling activity to train students to present researchers with textual sources to inspire and to facilitate education. The premises of the translation research dialectic were three. The translation was in part stimulated by current trends in research and teaching and integrated that which was external to the tradition. Secondly, translation and research could be linked in particular historical circumstances, and the critical translation of works were undertaken to surpass them. Finally, as a consequence, these translations occasionally stimulated the extension of translated knowledge and the elaboration of new theory. The history of circulation of mathematical knowledge has still a long way to go in revealing the heterogeneous networks and the diversity of actors and resources that went into the making of knowledge as much as in Europe as in India in the 19th century. Thank you very much.